Alright guys, hope everyone's doing well. Today is going to be part 5 of the Camper 6.0 build video series. And as you guys can see, it's coming along really well. I think it's looking pretty good. A couple housekeeping items. I have had a month gap between the part 4 and then today part 5 in this camper build series, and I apologize. In between that though, I had 2 videos, one that talked about the overall design considerations specific to this camper and some of the thoughts I have when I do other designs. So if you're interested in that, I know this has got some unusual shapes to it. That was the video immediately prior to this one. If you guys want to take a look at that, let's get right into it. As you guys can see, getting the outside material on this one is the biggest change. And on this particular one, I went with the cedar sided method. All of this stuff you see here, some of these little designs, this is just artistic designs to make the camper look nicer. So don't ignore that for the time being in terms of this specific build. But putting in these cedar sides, we're going to talk about that now. So hold on. All right, guys. So the cedar siding. Now this is all scrap wood, so bear with me. Starts with planks just like this. Now this is a 6-foot tall dog-eared cedar plank that's sold at most home stores here in the United States. And this plank is mostly sold, or almost exclusively sold, for the purposes of making a wooden fence. However, I, quite some time ago, ran across the availability of this source of cedar and was able to figure out a way that I can do some modifications to these boards and make the outside skin of these campers, which I think is actually quite beautiful. But before we go any further, let's talk about some of the characteristics of cedar which makes it a pleasurable wood to work with. Now, I've received over the years many of comments, a few of them very recently, where people see the wooden campers and they immediately assume they're exceptionally heavy. Well, they are wrong. Wood comes in a huge amount of varieties. I don't think I need to tell you guys that, with a huge amount of different qualities. Okay, some wood is very dense and very hard and very strong. Oak would be one species of wood that comes to mind, and other species of wood, like cedar here, has very different qualities. It's less dense. It's really lightweight. To be honest with you, it's not even really particularly that strong. It's a softwood, so most species of woods here in the United States at least are roughly divided in 2 broad categories: hardwood and softwood. The truth of the matter is the hardness of the wood is really spectral. There isn't a firm line that divides them. However, if you think about it that way, something like oak falls far on the hardwood side, and something like cedar is considered a softwood. However, even though it's maybe not the strongest wood out there, the advantages are its weight, which is very lightweight, but it's also very resistant to insects. It has natural oils in it, which repels those, and it's very resistant to being exposed to water and other environmental elements. So it makes for a very good wood for something like a camper, in the sense that it can, even though I put a finish on these and I hope to never have the wood itself directly exposed to moisture, it does tend, if there ever was an exposure, it does tend to do well. Another thing that cedar is very good at is it's very, what they call, dimensionally stable, which means all wood is going to expand and contract a little bit based on humidity, temperature, as the primary 2 factors. And cedar is no different. However, cedar tends to move a little less, and most importantly though, it's dimensionally stable in the sense that it will maintain most of its shape. It will not, it will cup and it will warp a little bit, but not nearly as much as something like a piece of pine. I think we've all taken a piece of pine, sat it in the shop, and came back a while back later and see it's all twisted up and cupped really bad. Don't get me wrong, cedar will do that, but less so. Alright guys, let me show you something outside real quick. One of the questions I get a lot is a lot of people believe that these cedar boards will dry up and fall out and the overall structure of the camper will not be that sound in time. And you know, I'll admit the first one I made was only 3 years ago, so I can't say, well, I have one that was made 20 years ago, it's fine. But I will give you another little anecdote of the longevity of this method. Let me show you guys right now. So this is a chicken coop that my wife and I made, about 3.5 years ago. And what you guys see up here, right here, is the cedar. I essentially use the same method to kind of box in the upper portion here of this chicken coop, using the same cedar, the same techniques as I do with the camper. And this is what it looks like after 3.5 years. Now, let me caveat a couple things. Now, to many of you, this may look a little rough, but I will make note, and I'll show you in there, these cedar boards that I use for this chicken coop were not playing down. So what you see here, kind of this rough texture on here, this is roughly what the cedar boards look like when you buy them at the home store. Now in the camper, I actually run all these cedar boards through a planer, straighten them out a little bit, but most importantly, kind of knock down this outer texture. Okay. Now you guys can see that in time. I don't remember, these might have actually been cupped like this when I put them in there. I wasn't too worried about precise craftsmanship on something like a chicken coop on the outside, but nonetheless there is a little bit of cupping here that you can see. Nothing that's led to any kind of moisture intrusion. But most importantly, and the biggest difference between this and the camper, is this cedar was completely unfinished. So essentially I bought it, I didn't plane it down, I did cut the half lap joints, which I'll show you in a little bit, and I attached it here, but this cedar has been entirely and completely exposed to the elements with no finish on it, just in its bare form for the last 3.5 years. And I think it's held up really, really well, not to mention the fact that this is the construction technique itself is held up, the gaps are still closed. So to me, I think this is a real lesson to show that this stuff is probably going to hold up pretty fine. Now there might be a little bit of movement, but I don't think it's anything that's extreme, and I think if anything it's what adds to the motif of this camper. For unfinished wood that's exposed to the elements, this is a little anecdote to me that thinks that this building technique is going to hold up pretty darn well with time. Alright guys, so let's talk about how this all works. So as you guys saw from the last build video, and if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that the frame structure of the camper is made out of also cedar that's laminated or glued together. This is a little sample chunk. So imagine that this is a vertical column, okay? And then I'm going to put the cedar boards on the outside to actually close up the structure, or sometimes I refer to it as skinning it, putting the skin on the camper, so to speak. So the first step is you have to cut what the internet is telling me is a half lap joint, which means, as you guys can see right there, now these were just scraps I pulled out of the bin. This one is a little bit uneven, but you can see what that joint looks like, and it should be about 50-50, meaning you cut off about 50% and the other 50%'s you know, like the let me put it this way, the width of this should be about the width of this, so you're cutting down about 50% of the depth of the wood here. Let me see if I can get this to focus in just a little bit better here. Okay. Now, obviously the other corresponding board is you would cut, now this one's a little less even, but it doesn't matter, this is just demonstration, but there's the other joint. So what you would essentially do is you would take your column, for example, which would be the overall frame structure, and you would put these boards on there. Now, one of the keys that makes this all work, and I'm not sponsored, this is the use of caulking as both a waterproofer, and it has the side benefit of having a real strong adhesive quality. I prefer the Dynaflex Ultra. This is an outdoor grade caulking, and what I really like about this is it has the ability to have, I believe it says, no, I don't remember where it's at on here, but it's supposed to have about a 30%, the ability to expand and contract by about 30%, which is important. Remember, we talked about before, all wood, including the cedar, is going to expand and contract perpendicular to the grain. So the grain runs this way, and it's naturally going to expand and contract right here. So as you guys can see, that when you attach these boards to the frame structure with changes in humidity and temperature and other factors, these boards, they're not so much moving on the frame itself, they're not like moving up and down on the frame, but they're moving like this, right? Does that make sense? So what happens is when you put these together, this little half lap joint here allows them to move, yet keeping the wall itself sealed, right? So what you would do is oops, sorry about that. So what you would do is when you go to put this in there, you would run a bead of caulking right here on the inside portion of the lap, and before you actually attach it to the frame, you would put caulking on the frame structure. Now I always use 18 gauge brad nails, pop a couple brad nails in here, and then I would take my corresponding piece, pop a few brad nails, and here they are. Now the gap I've been using has been, I use about a 1/16 of an inch gap, okay? And I found that works out really well. What typically happens is I buy these boards, I'll plane them down, usually to 1/2 inch. They're about 5/8 of an inch when you initially buy them, and then I try to actually mount them in pretty short order. But I found the general trend is instead of the boards getting expanding after the initial install, they tend to shrink a little bit. So I used to keep this gap a little bit bigger, and it was still fine, it was functional, but there were times where it expanded a little bit more than I was comfortable with. So on this one, I closed the gap up a little bit, and thus far I've been very pleased. Now, also in other builds I haven't, and I think it's fine, but on this build and some others I've chose to add a single screw to each board. So what I'll do is I'll put it roughly in the middle of the board, and after I put the caulking on there, use the brad nails to attach it, I'll drive one screw right in the middle. Don't put it on both sides, put it right in the middle, and then what that does is as this board expands and contracts a little bit, that screw won't tear it apart. Be careful though, you gotta pre-drill it if you can, because sometimes that screw can split the board a little bit. Usually you can kind of work around, it's not a big deal. But that's the general construction technique. And as you guys can see, let me change the perspective here. I think it turned out pretty darn well. Now, comparing and contrasting this to the boards that we saw on the chicken coop, you guys can see that these are a lot smoother. Any potential cupping or warping that was in place had been taken out when they were planed. Now that they're attached and held to the wall of the camper, they'll stay this stable from my experience. And I think some of that cupping and movement that you guys saw in the chicken coop, it's very likely those boards, I don't have a specific memory, I'll be honest, but it's very likely those boards had some of that cupping before I even put them in there. But the other huge difference in here is that this has a really high quality finish. So this finish is from a company called PPG Cetol, that's C-E-T-O-L, Prolux. And the finish specifically is what's called log cabin and siding in the butternut color. And again, I'm not sponsored by this company. I've used this finish on all of the campers that I've made using cedar, and I've been exceptionally pleased with it. It holds up really well. This has a lot of really strong pigments in there, so the desert sun doesn't gray out the wood. It's waterproof, it's relatively easy to install, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. They come in a couple different color tints. I've used the cedar and I've used the butternut. The cedar's a little lighter. I've also used, I think it's called original or natural, I don't remember the exact designation. But the cedar and that original or natural color or tint, whatever you want to call it, is quite a bit lighter. But I really like the butternut. This is my favorite. This is definitely the darker one For those who are familiar with the 3.0 project, the butternut was the same color that was used on that. But hey guys, in short, again, I've done a lot more on this camper, but this main discussion is the how I prepare and install that cedar siding. Very pleased with it, and my impression, based on my own anecdotes and just kind of working with this stuff, is I think this will hold up and work out well for a really, really long time, particularly if you keep up on the maintenance of putting additional finish or fixing any damages when it's necessary. So, all right guys, I appreciate all the viewership, and we'll see you guys later.